Welcome to EPG Pathshala. We are going to discuss a novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. I am Niladri Chatterjee, Professor, Department of English, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. There are few American novels that exemplify American culture the way in which The Great Gatsby does. This is an iconic novel for various reasons. It was written in the 1920s. The 1920s was a very important period in the history of American literature, a very important decade, because this was the time when America truly got to experience an unprecedented level of prosperity. And what we shall also see in the novel is how, on the one hand, that prosperity is represented, but also how that prosperity is also revealed as something that can bring about misery, unhappiness. So therefore, in The Great Gatsby, we have two things simultaneously. We have the representation of the American dream, where we have lots of material prosperity, but on the other hand, we also find a certain reflection of the way in which that American dream may lead to unhappiness, may lead to suffering, may lead to pain. Although the novel was first published in 1925, this is one of the novels that are now regarded as being the forerunner of the American novel. You can read the novel not only as a reflection of the Jazz Age, which was during the 1920s, but you can also read it as a critique of the Jazz Age, by which I mean that when F. Scott Fitzgerald is writing the novel, he is not entirely adulatory of the period. He is also acknowledging that the period and its desire for wealth and prosperity, for material gains, also has its darker side. Now, this particular period is called the Jazz Age because this is the time when a particularly unique form of American music was born, namely jazz. So we need to talk a little bit about jazz. Jazz was very much the result of the evolution of a kind of music which was known as the blues. The blues music was the kind of music which was basically evolved by the African Americans, by the blacks. So they started singing what was called the blues. Now, you may be familiar with the expression getting the blues or having the blues. So getting the blues or having the blues basically means being unhappy, being depressed. So when we look at blues music, most of blues music is about unhappiness. Most of the blues music is about sadness. That is the way in which jazz began. So it began out of blues music. But remember that it eventually became jazz. So when it became jazz, what happened was many other musical instruments were used. The beat of the music became up-tempo. So it became much more lively. So jazz, therefore, is a much more exciting, much more lively music than blues is. Blues is much more mournful. It is much sadder. But jazz is much more lively. It is also a kind of music that allows for a lot of improvisation. That is something that you must be aware of. Improvisation, what does it mean? It means that you can actually start off by playing a kind of tune and then you can gradually move away from that tune. You can go into a different tonal structure. You can develop that tune. You can experiment with that tune. All of that can happen while you're actually playing that music. So therefore, improvisation is a kind of a musical freedom. You're playing a particular element of music, and then what you start doing is you start to improvise on it. So you therefore use the music as it pleases you. You experiment with that music. You try to bring in new tonal varieties into the music. All of this happens as a part of jazz. So therefore, if you really have to understand what jazz is, you must therefore know that jazz is that kind of music which allows for an endless amount of improvisation. So when we think about improvisation, we think of it as musical freedom. So therefore, that should lead you to understand that jazz music, therefore, is basically a performance of freedom on the level of music. That is something that you have to keep in mind, because this notion of freedom is something which is so integral to American culture. It is so integral to American society. It is also equally integral to American literature. What we are going to see in The Great Gatsby is, how does this freedom work? Are we really free? What are the limits of that freedom? That is really, I think, these are the questions that Scott Fitzgerald is asking in the novel. But before we go into the novel, let me tell you a little bit about the author, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was born in 1896 to an Irish Catholic family of wholesale grocers in St. Paul, Minnesota. The family moved between Syracuse and Buffalo during Fitzgerald's childhood. Fitzgerald joined St. Paul's Academy at the age of 13 when he published his first short story. He later joined Newman School in New Jersey, and of course he joined Princeton University in 1913. He dropped out of Princeton and he joined the US Army. So F. Scott Fitzgerald actually served in the First World War. His first published novel was during this period, The Romantic Egotist, and this novel was not particularly well received. He was commissioned outside Camp Sheridan, outside Montgomery, Alabama, which is a southern state in America, where he met his future wife, Zelda Sayre. Zelda, of course, becomes a very, very important figure in F. Scott Fitzgerald's life, and in American mythology, Zelda occupies a rather unique place because in a very interesting way, she seems to be almost embodying the jazz age. So Zelda Fitzgerald is sort of the embodiment of what was called then the flapper. A flapper in the jazz age was a young woman who was out for a good time. She loved dancing, she loved singing, she loved drinking. So here was the figure of Zelda Sayre, who was the embodiment of everything that we normally associate with the flapper. Anyway, moving on with the story, he leaves the army and publishes another novel in 1920, This Side of Paradise, and the novel gives him instant success and he marries his wife. Now, this is where I would want to move away from his life a little bit, because soon after this comes the novel The Great Gatsby. I would want to concentrate on the characters. I would want you to see exactly how these characters are placed in the novel, why are these characters created, and what do these characters say about American culture in particular, and about American society in general. In the heart of the novel is the figure of J. Gatsby. Now, J. Gatsby is a rather mysterious figure because when we first meet him, and again at the end of the novel, we see him as a very, very wealthy man. He's a millionaire. He has a massive house. He throws enormous parties. So, J. Gatsby for us becomes somebody who is extremely wealthy and somebody who is constantly showing off his wealth. And we wonder, why is he showing off his wealth so much? What is the reason behind it? So if we look at the figure of James Gatsby or J. Gatsby, the first impression that we get is, okay, this is a man who has actually achieved the American dream. Because everything that we associate with the American dream, he has it. He has got money, he has got wealth, he has got professional success. So we look at J. Gatsby's life and we think this is exactly what the achievement of the American dream looks like. Except for the fact that we realize soon afterwards that J. Gatsby has almost everything, but not quite. There is one thing that he wants really badly and he doesn't have it. He doesn't have the love of Daisy Buchanan. This is the one girl that he always wanted to marry. This is a girl that he has cherished a love for many, many years, even when he was a boy, as a very young man, before he had all of this wealth. Daisy Buchanan, of course, is married to a very wealthy man, who we shall be introduced to later. But Daisy Buchanan, therefore, cannot possibly be J. Gatsby's wife because she's already married. But that does not stop J. Gatsby from actually cherishing this love for Daisy Buchanan. Now, into this extraordinary case of a man who is in love with a woman who is already married, into this story comes our narrator, Nick Carraway. Now, Nick Carraway, you have to understand, is somebody that we really need to pay a lot of attention to, because he is the first-person narrator of the novel. He is a Yale graduate and a First World War veteran. He's from the Midwest. He gets a job as a bond salesman in New York, and he rents a house in the fictive village of East Egg, Long Island. Now, this is something that I think you should be a little careful about. The entire novel is about the East Egg and the West Egg. And the East Egg and the West Egg, these two sort of geographical areas, they function almost like two poles of the earth, as it were. And there is almost like a binary that is being created. Anyway, so we have Nick Carraway, who lives in the East Egg. Gatsby lives in the West Egg. So that is something that I think you would need to keep in mind. Anyway, we move on now. As I have told you about Daisy Buchanan. Now, Daisy Buchanan is a beautiful and nervous debutante and a socialite. She is Nick Carraway's second cousin, and she, of course, is married to Tom Buchanan. And, of course, as you very well know, Daisy and Jay, they had an affair before Daisy got married. Tom Buchanan is also a millionaire. He also lives in the West Egg. Nick's acquaintance from Yale, where he was a football star. Tom Buchanan is perhaps somebody that you may want to think about as the villain in the novel. So if you think the novel has a villain, well, in that case, Tom or Thomas Buchanan is that villain. He has a very public affair with Myrtle Wilson. Myrtle Wilson is a married woman. She's married to George Wilson. George is owner of a car repair store. He's quite poor. He's quite sort of working class. And Tom Buchanan has got a lot of money. And basically, he likes to spend a little bit of that money on Myrtle. Myrtle, of course, is madly in love with Tom. But Tom treats both Myrtle and George with great contempt. And this is something that we really need to understand. He is a very strong and arrogant white supremacist and also misogynist. These are the terms that I think I need to explain a little bit. Who is a white supremacist? A white supremacist is somebody who actually believes that white men are superior to all other races. White people are superior to all other races. So therefore, can we think of Tom Buchanan as a racist? Yes, he is a racist. Because in the novel, you are going to hear him say that, oh, have you read this novel, The Fear of the Black Planet? So he reads all of these books that are completely paranoid, racist books that talk about what is going to happen if black people become the more dominant race in the world. As you can imagine, this is pure racism, and Tom Buchanan is a racist. Now, please try and understand that this is the 1920s. This is also the time when race relations are very, very bad. There are public lynchings that are going on, by which I mean that black people are actually taken out, they're beaten up, and they're hung from trees. This is a very, very painful time for the blacks. So remember that although slavery has ended, but there is a particular strain of very tenacious racism that is running amok. You have to remember that this is also the time of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. These are white supremacists who actually go around seeking out black people and killing them. So there is a lot of racism that is going on in the 1920s America, and we have Tom Buchanan as an example of that racism. Now we come to the character of Myrtle Wilson. Now Myrtle Wilson, as I told you, is George Wilson's wife and he's Tom Buchanan's mistress. She is disappointed with her marriage and she meets also a very, very tragic end when she is killed by Gatsby's car. And finally, we have the character of Mayor Wolfsheim. Now, Mayor Wolfsheim is a Jewish friend and a mentor of Gatsby's, and he's described as a gambler who fixed the World Series. World Series, of course, is a match. It's a sport, baseball match. And he only appears twice in the novel, and in the second instance, he refuses to attend Gatsby's funeral. So Mayor Wolfsheim is a slightly side character. He's not a very important character. And that is about it. So these are broadly the main characters in the novel. Let me now talk about the plot. As I told you that Nick Carraway, he finds a job as a bond salesman, and his house neighbors, he's close by Gatsby's mansion. He meets his cousin Daisy and her husband Tom Buchanan in West Egg, where he's introduced to Jordan Baker. Now, Jordan Baker I have not talked about so far. Jordan Baker is a golfer, so she is a sports person, and Jordan Baker occupies a rather interesting sort of relationship with Tom Buchanan, because what is happening over here is that not so much with Tom Buchanan or with Daisy, but with Nick Carraway, in the sense that there is a kind of a friendship that is certainly there, a friendship that could perhaps develop into a romantic relationship, but that doesn't really happen. They're not lovers in that sense. They're just friends. But there is certainly a romantic aspect to that friendship that doesn't really develop. Anyway, he learns about Tom's affair with Myrtle through Jordan. He accompanies Tom and Myrtle to their apartment where he witnesses their affair. Nick is invited to one of Gatsby's parties where he encounters Jordan Baker and Gatsby himself, whom he recognizes from the same division during the war. Nick learns of Gatsby's love for Daisy through Jordan. Gatsby wants Nick to arrange for a meeting with Daisy, which enables their awkward reunion. During a party at Tom's place, Daisy openly expresses her love for Gatsby and thereby enraging Tom. So you can see that it is not as though Daisy has fallen out of love with Gatsby either. So Daisy still continues to harbor love for Gatsby, although she knows very well that this is a love that has no future, because Daisy is clearly married to Tom. So there is no future to this love, but that love continues to be present. So this is where we come to the part where Tom forces the group to go to New York, where he confronts Gatsby at a hotel suite. He tells Gatsby that he could never understand the history of his relationship with Daisy. Tom reveals to Daisy that Gatsby is a criminal who earns his money from bootlegging alcohol, and Daisy realizes her allegiance is with Tom. Now, before I go on further, I perhaps need to explain what is bootlegging. Now, bootlegging is basically selling alcohol illegally. Remember that this is also the time of the prohibition. So therefore, you were not allowed to buy alcohol openly. Buying of alcohol was illegal. Consumption of alcohol was illegal. So therefore, you had all of these establishments that were growing up, which were called the speakeasies. Now, these speakeasies were like clubs. They were like bars. So you could go into these clubs and bars and you could consume alcohol. And this is also the place where a lot of jazz music was being played. So there's a very interesting relationship between the consumption of alcohol illegally and the development of jazz music. That is also something that we need to talk about. So here you have Tom, who reveals to Daisy that Gatsby's money is illegally earned. He's basically a smuggler. That is what Daisy learns about Gatsby. So this in itself reveals something about perhaps Scott Fitzgerald's own attitude towards the American dream. So we come to know that while Gatsby is, of course, a very, very rich man, but he has not actually acquired the wealth legally. So there is a certain darkness to the way in which he has acquired his wealth. Tom sends Daisy back with Gatsby, and on their way back, Daisy, who is driving Gatsby's car, hits Myrtle, killing her instantly. Remember, so therefore, unknowingly, Daisy causes the death of her husband's mistress. This is something that you have to remember. So it is not as though Gatsby kills Myrtle, it is Daisy who kills Myrtle, but of course the car is Gatsby's car. I think this is something that you should remember, because this will end up having a lot of repercussions towards the end of the novel. If we go back, then we are going to find that Tom and Jordan and Nick, on their way back, discover that Myrtle has been killed by Gatsby's car, and Wilson assumes Gatsby is his wife's lover, hunts him down and murders him and kills himself. So look at the way in which Gatsby ultimately dies in the hands of this man who thinks that Gatsby has been having an affair with Myrtle. Look at the way in which there are two sets of people in the novel, and look how one set of people suffer and another set of people don't suffer. You see, although Daisy is responsible for the death of Myrtle, she and her life remains unaffected. Although it is Daisy's husband who has been carrying on this affair with Myrtle, he remains unaffected. Nothing happens to Daisy, nothing happens to Tom. Who are the people who suffer? Yes, absolutely, Gatsby suffers. He is killed. Myrtle suffers. She dies in an accident. And of course, Myrtle's husband, Wilson, he also kills himself. So therefore, Nick arranges for an awkward funeral where he informs Gatsby's father and Mayor Wolfsheim. Disillusioned with the East, Nick leaves his job and returns to the Midwest. That is the way in which the novel ends. But that is just the surface. There are several things that are happening in the novel that I would want to spend some time on. I don't think it is a good idea to read the novel as being autobiographical, because of course there's a lot of invention that happens. The only things that perhaps F. Scott Fitzgerald takes from his own life is the fact that, the war veteran part, that is to say, like Gatsby and Nick, Fitzgerald also was a veteran from World War I. He also attended an Ivy League graduate. He was also an Ivy League graduate from Princeton University, and he falls in love with a woman whose love is the measure of self-worth. So there are certain similarities, but I think the similarities end there, because what F. Scott Fitzgerald is trying to do is he wants to investigate what is it that the American dream is about, and what is it about the American dream that could have dangerous, unhappy consequences. The narrative represents and is constituted by new technological modes of perception and of sociality. This is again a very important part of the novel, because you must understand that by the 1920s, technology has improved by leaps and bounds. So you have the car, you have the telephone, you have cinema, you have photography, you've got electric lighting. So America is experiencing an amazing blossoming of technology. Life has become easier, people are having a good time, there's a lot of money, and you can actually think about the 1920s as a party. You can think of the entire decade of the 20s as a party, and a party that suddenly ends in the year 1929 with the stock market crash. But till then, it's like a party that goes on for the entire decade. Now, these technologies are represented, but they also constitute the settings and tropes of the narrative. The telephonic conversation, for example, is symbolic of the impossibility of knowing the truth of the human heart. One cannot know what the other feels, and someone overhearing the conversation does not know who or what the person on the other end of the line is saying. So the telephone also serves to support Gatsby's illicit business tie-ups. So therefore, there is a very interesting use of technology in the novel, which I think we need to also address. Let's talk about the novel's central vision. This lies in the rise of consumerism, speculation, finance, the leisure class. Suddenly people have a lot of money. So there is a lot of leisure, there are a lot of leisure activities. The shift from industrialization to consumerism spells decadence in the idealism of the founding fathers and colonialists. The liberation and happiness are tied to the choices that capitalism has to offer. Even love is mediated by a love for things and objects. And you're going to find what may be called perhaps fetishes in the novel, in the sense that, Nick Carraway, for example, admires Gatsby's silk shirts. There have been several film adaptations of the novel, for example, and if you look at the latest film adaptation of the novel, you are going to find that there is a lot of emphasis on rows of pearls, for example. So cars, jewelry, nice clothes, big houses, these are the ways in which Gatsby is trying to create a sense of happiness for himself. But as we very well know that these are just material objects, they look wonderful, they feel wonderful, but ultimately they don't bring Gatsby happiness at all. Daisy's choice of Tom over Gatsby forms one of the central conflicts of the novel. Her love for Gatsby is mediated by the things that he possesses. Now, this new form of capitalism is constituted by finance and speculation. Nick and Gatsby's obscure jobs as bondsmen requires them to read books on business strategies. They issue long-term loans to businesses and industries. This is a shift from the old economy of industry and bank loans issued on the basis of paper guarantees. So therefore, look at the way in which The Great Gatsby is also a novel about newer professions, about the way in which the making of money becomes so very important to the American psyche. Fitzgerald maintains his aesthetic distance by conveying his ambiguous response to the jazz age through his character Nick. Because if you look at the attitude of Nick towards Gatsby, and indeed towards his own cousin Daisy, you are going to find that Nick is perhaps unhappy. He is conflicted. On the one hand, he would like to love Gatsby, and there are several indications in the novel that suggest that perhaps Nick is actually attracted to Gatsby. Maybe Nick is a little in love with Gatsby. There have certainly been critical articles to that effect. But what one must also understand is that Nick clearly is very, very uncomfortable about the way in which Gatsby has got his wealth. He is uncomfortable about the kind of irresponsibility that the rich exhibit, and this is something that comes across very strongly in the narrative. Nick is not the objective narrator he claims to be. He admires Gatsby for his apparent idealism despite knowledge of his corruption. Nick, however, expresses his dislike for Tom, who remains an arrogant, aggressive, and racist man. Nick is both he is both, as it were, the symptom and also the analyst of a class-based society. He acknowledges his snobbery even as he others those who are working class and of other communities. The novel ends on an ambiguous note. Meaning in the novel remains tied to Nick's developing perception of the East and Gatsby. Gatsby's idealism and his faith in the future of the American dream redeems his corruption in Nick's eyes, because ultimately what happens is that Gatsby perhaps can be read as an innocent. He is somebody who acquired all of this wealth not because he was actually lusting for wealth, because the whole point of Gatsby's acquiring of the wealth is because he wanted to impress Daisy with his wealth. He wanted to show Daisy that he is also capable of making a lot of money. So when we come to the end of this discussion, I would therefore want you to read The Great Gatsby as a rather interesting text, which certainly represents the American dream, but it also interrogates the American dream. It raises some very troubling questions about whether this American dream is all sweetness and light. Is it all so wonderful? Or does it also carry portents of misery, of unhappiness, of disillusionment, of pain, and ultimately what we see in The Great Gatsby, death? Thank you.